Susan's voice was steady, yet filled with venom. "Just pour the acid on her face and leave the husband," she told the men standing around their car. Amara and her husband were on their way to their wedding, happiness radiating from every pore, unaware that their closest ally had become their greatest enemy. The assassins blocked the road, creating a tense atmosphere as Amara's husband tried to make a call. One of the thugs, growing impatient, acted without thinking. A single gunshot echoed through the air. The husband collapsed, his phone slipping from his hand. "What have you done?" the boss yelled, enraged. "You weren't supposed to kill him!" Months earlier, the bond between Susan and Amara seemed unbreakable. Amara, down on her luck, had lost her job and was struggling to make ends meet. She moved in with Susan, who generously offered her a place to stay. However, the more Amara depended on her, the more Susan felt a growing resentment. Amara, grateful for the support, couldn't see the bitterness building in her friend. She was jobless and broke, while Susan had everything. One afternoon, they decided to go out to a local restaurant. As they enjoyed their meal, a ragged-looking man entered, clearly struggling. He had ordered food, but couldn't pay. The waitress began to shout at him, and the security guards were called to throw him out. Amara's heart softened at the sight, and she begged Susan to help. "Please, Nin, let's pay for his meal," Amara pleaded, but Susan was hesitant. "Why should I?" "He's just some random guy," Susan replied, rolling her eyes. After much pressure, she eventually paid, though reluctantly. The man, named Amika, was grateful beyond words. After Amika was saved from his embarrassing situation at the restaurant, he insisted on showing his gratitude. "Please, let me wash your car or do something to repay you," he said, but both women refused. Susan was irritated by the encounter, while Amara found Amika's humility endearing. Days passed, and small gifts began to appear outside Susan's house. A bouquet of wildflowers here, a basket of fruits there. Susan scoffed at them, annoyed by the cheap and meaningless gestures. "This guy again?" she said, tossing the gifts in the trash. But Amara, always seeing the good in people, was touched. She often begged Susan to let her keep the gifts, even if they were insignificant. Amika's feelings for Susan grew over time, and one day, he finally gathered the courage to ask her to be his girlfriend. "I like you, Susan. Will you be with me?" His voice was soft, full of hope. Susan, however, was anything but interested. She laughed in his face. "You? You don't even have enough money to feed yourself, let alone take care of me." Her words cut deep, but Amika didn't fight back. He quietly walked away, hurt but determined to keep his dignity. Amara, on the other hand, had noticed something special in Amika. His kindness, his perseverance, and his heart had slowly won her over. She admired his humility, and over time, her feelings grew into something deeper. Amara approached Susan cautiously. "He once asked you out, but you refused. Would you mind if I tried to get to know him better?" Susan laughed, finding the idea ridiculous. "Go ahead, Amara. I can't believe you'd want to date someone like him. He's got no future." But Amara didn't care about his financial situation. She saw his true worth. After months of growing close, Amika finally revealed the truth to Amara. He wasn't just the poor laborer she thought he was. In reality, he came from a wealthy family, but had chosen to live humbly to experience life on his own terms. Amara was shocked, but happy. Their relationship deepened, and soon, Amika proposed. Amara, overjoyed, accepted without hesitation. When Amara told Susan about the proposal, she expected her best friend to be happy for her. But instead, Susan felt something dark and bitter well up inside her. She had dismissed Amika, thinking he was beneath her, only to find out he was wealthy all along. Now, her best friend was going to marry him, and Susan couldn't bear it. In her desperation, Susan hatched a plan. Late one night, she called Amika to meet her, claiming she needed to talk about something important. When they met, Susan seduced him, and in a moment of weakness, Amika gave in. But as they were about to take things further, Amika insisted they use protection. He still had feelings for Susan, though he loved Amara. As he went to the bathroom, Susan saw her chance. She quietly poked holes in the condom, hoping to trap Amika into staying with her. Later, she told him she was pregnant, expecting him to leave Amara for her. But Amika saw through her lies and refused. "I'm marrying Amara. I won't betray her," he said firmly, leaving Susan alone and furious. On the eve of Amara's wedding, Susan made one last attempt to salvage her plan. She confronted Amara, begging her to step aside. "You don't understand, Amara. I wasn't thinking straight when I said he wasn't my type. I've done so much for you. Can't you do this one thing for me?" Susan pleaded, her voice desperate. But Amara, now pregnant and deeply in love with Amika, refused. "Susan, I love him. We're getting married tomorrow. Please, let it go," Amara said softly. Consumed by jealousy and anger, Susan couldn't accept it. She made a fateful decision that would change all their lives forever. She contacted a group of dangerous men, instructing them to stop the wedding. She thought it would be a simple scare, something to break the couple apart, but she had no idea how far things would spiral out of control. The morning of the wedding, everything seemed perfect. Amara and Ameka were on their way to the church, their hearts full of joy. But as they approached a deserted stretch of road, a group of men blocked their car. "What do you want?" Ameka asked, his voice calm but filled with tension. The lead assassin, annoyed by the unexpected question, waved him off. "Just stay quiet and no one gets hurt." But as Ameka shifted slightly in his seat, the gunman panicked. In a split second, a gunshot rang out. Ameka fell back, blood staining his white shirt. The leader of the group turned to the gunman, enraged. "You idiot! That wasn't the job!" he shouted. The assassin looked horrified, realizing his mistake. The plan had been simple: intimidate, not kill. But now, the situation had spiraled out of control. Amara screamed in terror, clutching her husband's lifeless body. The assassins, panicking, decided to finish what they started. One of them grabbed a bottle of acid from the van and poured it over Amara's face, burning her skin and disfiguring her beyond recognition. She screamed in agony, her cries filling the air as the men fled the scene, leaving her alone with her dead husband. As weeks turned into months, Amara's mental state deteriorated. The trauma of the attack had scarred her, not just physically but mentally as well. She began wandering the streets, her once beautiful wedding dress now torn and dirty, muttering to herself as she relived that fateful day over and over in her mind. Her parents, unable to control her, watched helplessly as their daughter descended into madness. Amara would run away from home, disappearing for days at a time, only to be found wandering aimlessly, lost in her own world. Susan, now a shell of her former self, drove through the city every day, hoping to avoid seeing Amara on the streets. But no matter how hard she tried, it seemed that every time she was out driving, there Amara would be, dirty, disheveled, and talking to herself. The sight was too much for Susan to bear, and each time she drove away quickly, her heart pounding with guilt and shame. One fateful evening, Susan returned home after a long day, only to find Amara curled up at her gate, her wedding dress now nothing more than rags. The sight sent a shiver down Susan's spine. Amara's eyes were wide and wild as she stared at Susan, mumbling under her breath. "Murderer! Murderer! You did this to me!" she screamed, pointing an accusing finger at Susan. The neighbors began to gather, watching the scene unfold, whispering among themselves. Susan's heart raced as Amara stood up, swaying slightly, her movements jerky and unnatural. Without warning, Amara pulled a small, rusty knife from her tattered dress and started charging toward Susan, waving it wildly in the air. "You ruined my life!" she shrieked. Terrified, Susan rushed inside her house, slamming the door behind her. She stood there, her back pressed against the door, heart pounding in her chest. She could hear Amara banging on the door outside, shouting, "You're a murderer! Everyone needs to know what you did." The situation had become unbearable. Susan's friends were starting to suspect that something was terribly wrong. Amara's constant accusations, the madness in her eyes, and the way she always seemed to seek out Susan. It was all too much. Susan's friends began to whisper, wondering if Susan had something to do with Amara's downfall. They had noticed how distant and nervous she had become, how she avoided talking about what had happened to Amara. One evening, after another public outburst from Amara, Susan sat alone in her room, overwhelmed by guilt and shame. She couldn't take it anymore. Susan wrote a short note, apologizing to her friends and family, but leaving out the truth about Amara. She swallowed a handful of pills and lay down on her bed, waiting for the darkness to take her. But her friends, worried about her unusual behavior, had been checking on her more frequently. When they found her lying motionless, they rushed her to the hospital just in time. Susan survived, but the attempt left her shaken, and her friends became even more suspicious of her involvement in Amara's tragedy. Days after the suicide attempt, Susan tried to move on, but Amara's madness continued to torment her. One afternoon, Susan decided to stop by the supermarket to pick up a few things, hoping to distract herself from the constant fear and guilt. She parked her car, hoping for a moment of peace. But when she came out of the supermarket, her peace was shattered. Her car windows were completely smashed, shards of glass littering the ground. Amara stood by the car, a large rock in her hand, her face twisted in fury. "You will never escape me!" she shouted, her voice carrying across the parking lot. Susan froze, staring at the destruction. People around her were beginning to gather, watching with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Embarrassed and terrified, Susan rushed toward her car, but Amara blocked her path. "You think you can hide from what you did? You killed him! You destroyed my life!" Amara screamed, her voice cracking with emotion. The crowd began to murmur, some people pulling out their phones to record the scene. Susan's face burned with shame. She didn't know how much longer she could keep up the facade. Her friends, who had come to help after her suicide attempt, were beginning to connect the dots. They questioned her more frequently, asking about Amara, but Susan continued to lie. She couldn't bring herself to tell the truth, fearing the consequences of her actions would ruin her life completely. One evening, after months of torment, Susan realized she couldn't live like this anymore. She had caused irreparable damage to Amara's life, and her guilt was destroying her from the inside out. She needed to do something, anything, to make amends. But how could she ever right such a wrong? Susan decided to visit Amara's parents, hoping to find some way to help. As she stood at their doorstep, her heart raced. She hadn't spoken to them since the incident, and now she was afraid of what they would say. Would they see through her lies? Would they hate her even more? When Amara's mother opened the door, her eyes were full of sorrow. "Susan, it's been a long time," she said softly. "Amara is not well. We don't know what to do anymore." The words hit Susan like a punch to the gut. She had done this to her friend, and now her friend was lost. Susan's heart raced as she stood in the living room of Amara's parents' house. "I need to tell you something," Susan finally whispered, her voice barely audible. The room fell silent, Amara's father and mother looking at her with expectant, weary eyes. Susan took a deep breath, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. "I did this to her," Susan said, her voice cracking. "I caused everything. It's my fault that Amika is dead and that Amara has lost her mind." Amara's father, Okafor, sat up straight, disbelief flooding his face. "What did you just say?" His voice was cold, sharp like a knife. I paid those men to stop the wedding," Susan continued, her eyes filled with tears. "I was jealous of Amara. jealous that she was going to marry Amika. I never wanted them to kill him, but they did. It wasn't supposed to end like this. Without warning, he shot up from his seat and slapped Susan across the face. The force of it knocked her back, her hand instinctively flying to her cheek. Her vision blurred with tears, the stinging pain of the slap paling in comparison to the overwhelming guilt she felt. "You ruined my family," Okafor roared, his voice trembling with fury. "You killed my daughter's husband. You destroyed her life." His eyes burned with an intensity that Susan had never seen before, and for a moment, she thought he might strike her again. But instead, he turned to Neka, his voice cold. "Call the police." Neka, sobbing shakily, pulled out her phone. Susan, frozen in place, didn't resist. She knew this was her fate. There was no escaping the consequences anymore. As the police arrived and led her away in handcuffs, the weight of her guilt finally became unbearable. Her heart pounded in her chest as they escorted her out of the house. She could hear the murmurs of the neighbors, see the flashes of their cameras as they recorded her walk of shame. But the worst part was yet to come. As the police car drove down the street, Susan's eyes widened in horror. There, standing on the side of the road, was Amara. She was barefoot, her dress torn and dirty, her belly swollen with the unmistakable signs of pregnancy. Her eyes were wild, and she was laughing with a madness that sent shivers down Susan's spine. "You're going to pay for what you did!" Amara shouted, her laughter echoing in Susan's mind. She clutched her stomach, almost protectively, as if the child inside her was the only thing left tethering her to the world. "You'll never escape this!" Susan's heart raced as the car pulled away, Amara's laughter growing fainter, but still echoing in her ears. She was now fully trapped in the consequences of her actions, knowing there was no redemption left for her. Months later, in the cold, sterile walls of a prison cell, Susan received news she had been dreading. Amara had given birth to a baby girl, but she had not survived the birth. Susan collapsed to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. The reality of her actions had come crashing down around her. She had destroyed everything, Amika, Amara, and now, even their child was left motherless because of her. And so, Susan lived the rest of her life in darkness, forever haunted by the ghost of Amara, the consequences of her jealousy leaving an indelible mark on her soul.